Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the EPC Friday Update, our weekly look at the key developments on COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global role and for European politics in general. Unusually for us, it's a Friday afternoon, not a Friday morning, and that is because we wanted to bring you instant analysis of what's been happening at the EU's virtual summit today. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me, as always this week, are Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, Fabian Zuleeg, the Chief Executive of the EPC, and we're joined again, she's a regular guest in this slot, by Marta Pilati, who is Policy Analyst in the EPC's European Political Economy Programme. So welcome to you all. As always, this session is totally interactive. There'll be questions from me, and then I hope from some of you in this hour, which we are devoting entirely to the outcome of the summit. So European Council President Charles Michel said before the virtual meeting that this should be, and I quote, a crucial stepping stone towards an agreement. Was it? Did it take us forward in terms of seeing where there is the broadest agreement and where the deepest divisions are between member states? And where do we go from here? That's what we're going to discuss. Housekeeping before I turn to our panel. Your microphones are, as always, muted. If you want to ask a question when I open to the floor and you want to speak, click on the hand-shaped button and I will unmute you and give you the floor. Or you can write your question, as always, just click on the enter a question button, write it, hit enter. And again, my usual plea, very short questions if you could please, so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it's to. So, enough of that. Marta, let me turn to you first. And just before we get into any detail here, Ursula von der Leyen said it was a very positive summit. Charles Michel said he felt a strong common political will to engage. All very positive mood music, but what is your snapshot assessment of where we are now after this summit? Was it a success? Was it a failure?
Well, I would say it wasn't neither. Let's say the summit didn't take us backwards. So that's already a result because the summit feared that actually more member states would become more critical even of the Commission proposals. So I would say overall it's quite positive. Nobody expected an agreement today. The lines of these agreements are just restated, so nothing new really was brought to the table. And I think there are also some overall good points of agreement. First, as you said, there is an agreement that there needs to be a common response. So that's already something. And also that this has to be agreed in the summer. That's also something else, because maybe some could have asked for more time. And lastly, there is overall consensus on the fact that the Commission will borrow on the markets. So that's a good step actually, because it wasn't taken for given that all the countries would agree to this.
Okay, lots of things to delve into in a little while, but let's get a snapshot assessment also from Fabian and Janis. I gave that quote, Fabian, from Charles Michel about I felt a very strong common political will to engage. Forgive me for being a bit cynical, but isn't that politician diplomat speak for we didn't get anywhere?
I don't think it's that negative. I think what they agreed on is that they need to agree on in the next summit. And I think this is really the crucial step. We always knew it would be the German presidency which has to bring this home. It clearly is the political weight which is needed to push this over the line. To have that in July, I think, is the right signal. And we now will have a concrete proposal from Michel. So there are steps forward, but I think anyone who expected that this summit would now agree on the fund, agree on the MFF, I think doesn't know how the European system works. That was never likely to happen. So overall, I think it's a step forward, but clearly it's not the historic summit at which the decisions will be taken.
And indeed, Janis, there was a lot of managing expectations in the run-up to the summit, precisely to say this is not the summit where dramatic things will happen. But from your point of view, did we move forward at all?
Yes, I think we move forward because now at the next summit, which will be a real summit in the sense that they will meet, they actually need to get an act together. Whether it will be the last act in this story, we don't know. There are even rumors that we might have a second European Council meeting, one in person, after the mid-July one. But I think this, if I would sum it up, I would say that this Red Show summit was a political hors d'oeuvre. You needed exactly this in order to move to the next stage. And yes, expectations were low, no big surprises, an exchange of known positions. And as Marta said, the positive thing is that they didn't disagree more than we knew that they were disagreeing before they had this virtual meeting, because there were fears that we might witness a hardening of the different positions, that hardliners become even more hardliners, and that the situation then becomes even more difficult. But now we are where we are. This is Chefsache. Michel has to come up with proposals, and then you get to the next step. So this is why I say this was the political hors d'oeuvre you needed at this stage.
And Marta, from your point of view, then, if what we got was basically a rehearsal of well-known positions, and in fact, Charles Michel confirmed that because he said in the press conference just an hour ago, it was very useful to identify where we feel we're moving in the direction and where the topics remain very difficult. It has to be said, the very difficult topics was quite a long list. But in the run-up to the summit, what did we learn about how member states have been reacting to these proposals, how they're lining up? For example, are the frugal four, as they are often referred to, those more hardline countries, Austria, Denmark, Netherlands, and Finland, are they digging in their heels even harder, or do we see that where a compromise might emerge, for example, on the grants and loans issue? What did we learn before the summit about how member states are lining up now?
Well, yes, as you said, there's a lot of things on which member states don't agree on. Let's say that overall, you have a group of countries that is very much aligned to what the Commission proposed. These are France and Germany on broad terms, but also all the Southerners, Slovenia as well. Then you have some Central Eastern European countries who instead are a bit more critical on especially allocation criteria. So they would want presumably to change that so that the distribution of funding is more maybe less focused on especially southern countries. And then, as you said, you have the frugal countries who I have to say have been quite vocal. They wrote an article to the Financial Times just a few days ago, reinstating the red lines, which include the rejection of grants, for example. So they insist that the system should be loans for loans. They insist that the need for the presence of reforms, so conditionality is attached. And they also question the overall size and the allocation criteria. But some have seen that this was maybe moderate. They are restating their position, but I would say they're not shutting the door completely closed. So I think we can see some scope for agreement. And here is where I think rebates will play a big role. They've been mentioned a lot of times today at the press conference, and that seems to be possibly a way out. So allowing the frugals to maintain, and why not even increase their corrections to their contributions to the budget in exchange basically for their yes to the package.
Okay, Fabian, I mean, your sense really of what's going to be most difficult, and do you agree with Marta? They are talking tough, but she said they're not slamming the door shut. Do you see where we might come to something, and what for you is going to be most difficult?
I think it's important to first recognize how different the world now looks from what we had pre-COVID. The idea that we would have a summit, which broadly speaking is positive on the MFF, is positive on having loans at the European level, that we have a landing zone in which we are moving. Yes, there's still a lot which needs to be done, but politically, it's an enormous difference to where we were before the crisis. And I think for me, this will be the overarching driver behind all of this. In the end, no matter where the countries stand, no matter what objections they have, I think everyone recognizes that an agreement will be necessary and that you will have to come to some kind of compromise. Of course, it's going to be a compromise. There cannot be a European decision which is not a compromise, but there is an acceptance that a compromise will have to happen. And I think that in itself will drive through agreement, most probably in July. Also, it could be that it takes a bit longer. Janis has said before, you need 2 moments of drama, so maybe this is too early for that second moment. But I think overall, we all know that we are moving in that direction and that it has to be done. And I think the key thing to consider is what would be the alternative? What could we do if there was nothing, in case we get to a point where it is clear that no agreement can be found? The markets will react, governments will react, populations will react. So this is just simply not an option.
So that signal, very much underlined by Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel at the press conference about starting with, look, we agreed that we need an exceptional response, an ambitious response, that this is justified. As Fabian is saying there, Janis, perhaps we're now taking that for granted when even a month ago, there were many people questioning whether the EU should play that role at all. So do you share his analysis that we've come a long way, and what for you are the most difficult points?
Well, first of all, if you look back, Fabian was talking about where we were before the crisis. If you only look back 4 or 6 weeks ago, there were a lot of ideas floating around, but there was no certainty in which direction things might be moving. Then we had the Franco-German proposal, which I think was a key moment, and then the Commission's proposals, which now allow us at least to know potentially what the landing zone looks like. We have no one who has said, we fully disregard these proposals, we're not in line with them. Many people say, many governments say, we're dissatisfied with aspects A, B, and C, and I think this is the normal process. We have some group building, the Google were mentioned, but there are also other groups. I think we need to be careful not to create the impression that this is A versus B. There's a much more heterogeneous picture among member states, among the different fractions, the different groups, and I think there will be things also which will be coming up, which now, for example, were not mentioned during the press conference, things which will be also determining as to whether there will be a success, which will be stepping stones, which will be problems which will be created. But I think we've come a good way. And I think now in July, you have the next moment of, now you actually will have negotiations, because what we had today was just an exchange of opinions. We will have negotiations. I'm not sure that we will get to a final conclusion mid-July, but we're moving in that direction. We need to get to the point where we have 2 or 3 sticking points which will have remained, which you then need to overcome. And then, as it is Chefsache, actually, we will see that it will be in the hands of some in the European Council. I think the German presidency, i.e. in this case, Angela Merkel, will play a key role to overcome the final obstacles. But we're moving in the right direction. Maybe some might say not fast enough, but I think it's moving, and that makes me more positive than probably we were 6 or 8 weeks ago.
Okay, just to follow up on a couple of those sticking points, Marta, if I might, particularly on the question of allocation, because this seems to be actually where a lot more of the attention has focused in discussions between member states. And I was struck by Charles Michel emphasizing one of his sort of 3 key points. One was they agreed it was exceptional. Second, they agreed that the focus must be on regions most affected. Now, there has been some concern at the, I think it's called an allocation key that the Commission had proposed, which rather would have done it on old lines. If I understand this rightly, is this about, do we help those most affected by COVID, or do we help those we were already trying to help before the crisis? What's at the nub of this argument, and why is it proving already such a contentious point?
First, these allocation keys are referring to just part of the whole Next Generation EU, so the Facility for Recovery and Resilience, but that's the major part.
Right.
So it makes sense to generalize a little bit. And it's true that the allocation criteria that had been proposed by the Commission are basically population, so bigger countries would get more funding. GDP per capita, so poorer countries would get relatively more funding, and then unemployment between 2015 and 2019. And this latter one is the one criteria that has been criticized the most. Many countries, including the frugal, say that there is no point actually in considering unemployment over the past 5 years, and they would rather have a criteria that focuses on something that is related to the current crisis. I think there is some sense behind this criticism. I think what the Commission did was using this criteria to proxy for the COVID impact, which is very difficult to calculate already, given that southern EU countries are also those that have higher level of unemployment over the past 5 years. What they could do, for example, is look at the criteria the very Commission has proposed for the cohesion top-up. And here they're talking about GDP loss compared to 2019. They're talking about unemployment change since January 2020. So these criteria are already on the table for another program. And I think there might be scope to maybe work on those to make it more, to find a common ground, let's say, and on paper at least link this more to the effects of the crisis.
But Janis, does this argument over allocation suggest that part of the political landing zone is that in order to make it clear this is exceptional and that this is being done in response to an exceptional crisis, you must link it very directly to the impact of COVID, that element of it, not the MFF element. Otherwise, the exceptionality of this moment is not maintained, and that increases the fear, for example, among the frugal four, that this is how we're going to operate long term. So if we apply the old rules, this is just going to become part of our system. And Marta actually wrote a very good commentary, a very interesting commentary published this week about why she thinks some of these changes should be more permanent. I'll come back on that, but I'm wondering about the politics of this emphasis on COVID-19.
Well, first of all, I think yes, the frugal four, but also others, not only them. Again, I think we need to be careful when we characterize member states and put them into groups. Are fearful that this might become something of a permanent mechanism that is not only crisis related. I think that these fears are overstretching things. I think that this is an exceptional moment. These are exceptional measures. These are exceptional instruments, which will not become permanent. They might become permanent in the sense that if in the future you will be confronted with similar situations, you might use them again. So I wouldn't be that fearful of that. But I think what is a justified concern is that actually the money goes to those who need it most, the countries, regions, sectors that need it most. And that's difficult to judge as we're still in the beginning of the crisis. And as Marta was saying, there are also ideas already out there, also in the context of the overall proposals, of how to make a judgment call, which might be looking more at the direct effects since February, March. But again, we're just in June, so seeing the overall effects, being 100% sure, is very difficult. But I think that is something that can be overcome. But I think we also need to be careful not to think that this is the only problem. Conditionality is something which is an issue. By the way, it's also an issue from a German perspective. So again, it's not only those who have been very strong together with the French arguing that the money needs to go to those who are in the need of most of it. But then again, they also say we need to have clear-cut criteria, and Angela Merkel is saying that. But there are many other issues which are also on the table. You mentioned earlier the balance between loans and grants. This is still a discussion which we're having. The overall size is not a given deal. It's the own resources, which was already mentioned. The European Parliament is saying without new own resources, we will not agree to that. And Sassoli was very clear on that also today, because he also met the EU leaders in the beginning of the summit, of the virtual summit. The duration, Angela Merkel is saying maybe 2024 is too long, maybe it could be shorter. But The rebate question, which is another key issue which needs to be decided, which is important, especially from the net payers' perspective. So there are a lot of issues which you need to find an agreement on, and conditionality is only one of them.
And I wanted Fabian to come back on the question of conditionality, because it's conditionality in two senses. It's the old conditionality and the link to the European semester and so on. And it's the conditionality of you need to use this money to contribute to the transformation of economies and societies, the green transition, the digital transition, and so on. How do you see that argument playing out? Where do you think we'll get to? And is it this sort of balancing? Because I was quite struck that Ursula von der Leyen again referred to reforms as one of the key pillars of member states where they were in agreement today. So how do you see the conditionality argument playing out?
I think it is clear we need conditionalities. I would say it's maybe not necessarily that clear from an economic point of view, but it is clear from a political point of view. There will be a number of countries which will simply not accept any package which doesn't have at least a veneer of conditionalities attached to it. Now, those conditionalities will also contain the future priorities of the European Union. They are agreed priorities, so in that sense, they are not controversial. But the question with any conditionality is always, does it bite in the end? Will you get a change in behavior, a change in spending resulting from it? And in the end, I'm rather skeptical because what we're talking about here is the need to spend enormous amounts of money rather quickly, because if you don't do that, then you're not going to have the impact on the economy, you're not going to have the impact on employment which you're seeking to. So I'm sure there will be a lot of investment aimed at digital, aimed at green, but the key thing here will be about getting the money spent. And the conditionalities for me are more about reassuring some of the member states, making sure this is something which you can sell in the public opinion, rather than something which will really bite.
Absolutely. Marta, just coming back to this point that Janis was making about some member states saying it's too long, 2024 is too long. You argued in the commentary I mentioned a little earlier that the increased funding for the green transition, for the technological transition in Next Generation EU should be made permanent. And I think you were by saying by that in some way embed those changes in the EU budget, in the Multiannual Financial Framework. How would that work, and what do you say? What would you say to those who say, no, we will only do this if it's temporary? We are not willing to sign up to something that isn't a direct response to COVID, and because it's so urgently needed right now. What would your argument back be for making some of these provisions more permanent?
Yes, so the point is that Next Generation EU has a big chunk of money that is unrelated to the crisis. So the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the Solvency Instrument. And these, I think it's rightly so that they're temporary because they're an exceptional response to a special crisis. But what the Commission does at the same time is increasing the budget of regular EU budget programs. And here I'm talking about Horizon Europe, humanitarian aid, rural development, the Just Transition Fund, and international cooperation, for example. And I think what this does is very good because it brings the MFF structure towards something that is a bit more aligned and more fit to the future challenges of the green digital transition, international cooperation. And I think it's a pity that this increased budget ends relatively in the short term. So we have commitments until 2024, then yes, payments will go on for a couple more years. But what it does is that when Next Generation EU will be over, the MFF structure will just go back to what it was before. And what it was before, it's something that is not fit for investing where we need investment. So what I think could be done at this moment is use this political will we see right now to make this increase in budget entrenched in the MFF structure. so that when we are in 2028 rediscussing the MFF, we will have at least a basis of negotiation that is already a bit more modern, a bit more fit for purpose than what we had before. And this doesn't come with extra budget, extra debt issuing. So it's really about the MFF structure.
Thank you. Janis, you wanted to come in, and then I want to ask one more question, then we'll go out to the room. So keep those questions coming in. Janis.
Two short points. One, with respect to Marta's proposals and the ideas she put down in the commentary, which I think make a lot of sense. The problem is that in the current situation, I think it will be difficult to make sure that you have a certain level of permanence because of what we were talking about earlier, that member states are afraid that this might become that these mechanisms might become more permanent. This is exactly what they want to avoid. They want this to be crisis related. But what we've seen in many of the MFFs of the past is that you will have a midterm review, which by more or less will probably take place when the exceptional measures will have been concluded. So I think that will be the right moment to say, okay, what we've done over the past years was exceptional. However, there are some lessons to be learned from how did we use that money in the smartest way? Where actually did it prove that we had the best positive effects by using these additional resources which we put into that? I think this could give a boost to this moment in time, the midterm review, which you've had in the past, but at the end of the day, it didn't lead to a lot of change. So there might be an opportunity here. Second point, we were talking a lot about conditionality, and then you asked as to whether the money will be used in terms to support the priorities which have been set, Green Deal, digitalization. Here, I think there's a strong discussion among member states with respect to how concrete will the priorities be defined. There's a feeling that they might be too vague, and that actually that will hinder to effectively use the money. By the way, some fear that you might use too much of that money because they hope that the money will, at the end of the day, will not all be spent, especially those who are critical of the overall size of the additional funding. So how to define the priorities in a more direct, concrete way is going to be another challenge. And by the way, that's also linked to the governance structure, which is a nice word which is being used by some member states, saying that we are worried about the governance system behind how the allocation will happen. And here, I think you can clearly see that there is a fear of some member states that the Commission might become too powerful, that the Commission might have means at its disposal, using it, which at the end of the day will make it more powerful in the system.
On the other hand, if the Commission doesn't have any control, then how do you make sure the money is spent as intended? Can I just ask, Fabian, do you believe, please do pick up on what you want to, but I wanted to just add a question. Do you believe then that this could be a turning point, or if not now, at the midterm review stage, for, I think the phrase that Janis used was using money in the smartest way? Not always been the criteria in my 30 years of covering EU budget negotiations, not usually the final defining criteria of how the money gets allocated. Could this be a turning point?
Well, a turning point is always a difficult term to use. I think, yes, there are some reasons why it would actually make sense. And what I would emphasize here is it would actually make sense, particularly to some of the net payers, which have been talking for years about reforming the EU budget, making it more adapted to future priorities, making sure that money is spent on the right things in the right way. So in many ways, what Marta's proposal is what we shouldn't do is to put in a sunset clause on exactly these kind of reforms, which these countries have wanted for a very long time. So for me, this would make sense, but we are talking about the MFF. We are talking about member states and finance ministers discussing how much money they want to give to the European Union. And what makes economic sense or what even makes political sense is not necessarily what the outcome is going to be. So I think what we are going to see is a compromise, and that compromise is not going to go as far as some people hope. But I think what we have to also bear in mind, while yes, we have a negotiation now, which is about setting the multi-annual financial framework, putting this recovery instrument into place. But the reality, in my view, is that this is by far not the last time we're going to be discussing this, because the nature of the crisis, the nature of the changes which are coming through are so fundamental that this cannot be the last step in this process. So we will have to return to this. We will have to return to the question of what can be done at the European level. How can we best do this together? And that is, in my view, inevitable. So in some ways, what we are looking at here is really opening the door to those discussions in future. We need to get it into place. So don't get me wrong, it's absolutely essential.
That may not be the time to go much further with it. There's a question from the audience from Andres Pettersons, who is a regular participant in the weekly update, who asks about the timing question. I did want to come this. He's asking what the consequences would be of no agreement in July. Does this all risk getting mixed up with Brexit? But I really had a more fundamental question linked to that about, is it really possible? I mean, Charles-Michel enumerated the areas of difficulty. You've all enumerated the areas where there is no agreement. It is now the 19th of June. Mid-July. I mean, in my experience again of all these years, to get a deal, but even if there are 2 summits in July, is it feasible? I've even heard people suggesting that sometimes people talk about getting it by the end of the summer, and now there's a negotiation on what does the end of the summer mean? When would the end be, to give themselves a bit more wiggle room? So my question really is, how likely is it that we can do it in July? And Andrews's question, what happens if we don't? He's linked it to Brexit, which we'll come back to later. But more broadly, what are the consequences if we don't do it in July? Who would like to come in on that? Fabian.
I think it's a question of how don't we do it in July if we don't do it in July. I think it is possible to do it in July, and I think there will be a lot of political pressure, also because the German presidency doesn't want this to slip into the autumn, to slip into all of the other policy areas. Also because the longer it takes, the less effect this package will have in the short term, which is clearly an important consideration given that the economic crisis is happening now. It's not going to be only happening next year. So I think it is possible. It might well be that you need the 2 moments of drama, but if this means that you have a summit, you make progress, you go home, you come back the following week or 2 weeks later, and then you finish it, then I don't think that would be a problem.
But you think it can be done in July?
I think it can be done. I think it very much depends on the German presidency. I think the German presidency will have to engineer things. It will depend also on the institutions. So one of the things I would hope is going to happen from now until that summit is that there's intense negotiation already going on, where there are, particularly in some of the key capitals, where the core elements of the compromise are now being put into place, and then it can be done. But I think what would be detrimental is if we end up slipping properly into autumn, not only because of the issue of timing and the effect that could have, but also it could well be that the longer these negotiations go on, the more difficult it gets, rather the easier it gets. So we could be in a situation where we then end up with no agreement at all, and clearly that would be the worst of all worlds.
Janis, I think you wanted to come in on this, Marta, too, and then I'll take some questions from the floor.
I think that if you compare it to where we were a week or 2 weeks ago, I remember at our last Friday update, we also discussed how are the chances that we will get an agreement in July, and we were saying maybe in the most optimistic scenario there's a chance. I think chances now are higher. They're higher because you've raised expectations. Chancellor Merkel yesterday saying in the Bundestag, we hope that we will have an agreement before the summer break. We know that there will be a summit mid-July. So you're increasing the pressure to actually get to an agreement, either at the next or the second. the European Council real meeting. So I think chances have actually increased. I agree that the situation in fall might not look better if the economic situation deteriorates to find an agreement. Second, time is of essence, because the longer it takes for the money, the support to get to the countries which actually need it, the longer it takes, the less that money will be useful, will actually achieve the aims, the objectives it is trying to achieve, which is to make sure that the outcome of the economic crisis is not as bad as one would think. And now, if you put yourself into those who are critical, you put yourselves into the position of the frugals and others who are critical. Imagine you don't have an agreement in July. That already will give a very negative political signal, which is also negative for them. You get beyond the summer, you try to find an agreement, it might be more difficult. Whereas if you find an agreement in July and the situation worsens after the summer, the argument will be, look, we found an agreement in July, now we see the situation economically is worse, so maybe we need more, but let's first of all implement what we decided in July. Okay. Let's then also absorb the money which is there, because there's a big question with respect to the absorption capacity of individual member states. Okay. And so even from the frugals, I think July might be the better option.
Okay. There's a couple of hands up in the audience, but Marta, did you want to add anything here?
Yes, just something on what happens after there is an agreement. So it's not just that once the leaders agree, then that's it, the payments can start. So Next Generation EU needs to be ratified by all national parliaments, and in some countries, regional parliaments. And we know from the past what happened in some regional even parliaments, even in this very country, that can take months. So unfortunately, there is also an issue to that. If we go to October, then the time that it will take to get through your national parliaments, it's huge. And let's not forget that after that, there needs to be the negotiations between the Commission and the member states on the plans that member states will put in place to get this money. So we're really talking about a long period of technical and legislative work after the political agreement. So that's one more reason for the sooner the better.
Okay. Going out to the room, John Palmer, you have the floor. John.
Thank you.
Are you there?
I entirely share the general judgment of the panel on the prospects for getting an agreement, not least because, as has been said, a growing sense that the challenge is unavoidable if action is not taken in the reasonably short term. I wonder, though, whether you share with me an impression, I can't say more than that, from looking at opinion polling through the 27 and national tests of opinion, that there is something of a sea change occurring in public opinion about the question that the combination of COVID and the coming economic crisis and the Green Prospect New Deal demands a basic change in direction of policy. So it's not merely a matter of governments, that there is some evidence that population opinion is moving as well. Am I wrong about that?
So you mean, John, that this will be, if EU leaders can take these bold decisions, they'll be much easier to sell because public opinion is moving the same way? Am I understanding you right?
Exactly so, much less of a backlash against.
Any comments to that? Fabian?
I think it's very difficult to say, and I'm not saying that to avoid the question, but I think we are in an exceptional period, and that will also have an impact on opinion polls, on the way people look at things. I would think that, for example, people who are in lockdown look at the world very differently from people who are not, and I think we are going to see that some of the changes which we have seen in this lockdown period will be permanent and some of them will not. And I think at this moment, it's incredibly difficult to say which ones are going to be there for the longer period. Just to take up one of the examples, I have concerns that as we're going forward, that there might well be a situation where jobs become the absolutely overarching priority, and that we will see that in many countries the idea of green investment will be, yes, still there, but green investment if it produces jobs. But if you need to build a road, if you need to do something else to get jobs, I think the pressure is going to be very high. So I think this is going to be a balancing act, and I'm not sure where we are going to end up. But what is true, and I think this is something where I do see also a permanent change, is clearly in a crisis like this, populations rely on governments. They rely on the bodies which are there, the authorities which are there to address, to solve the problems. And I think this is, there is going to be a very high pressure on member states and on the European Union to deliver.
Absolutely. So anyone want to add anything on that? Janis?
Yes, I think we need to be careful. Yes, on the one hand, we see in many member states in different opinion polls that people are worried, that they think that we cannot continue as we've done because of the COVID experience. Also, we've talked about it in the past in other Friday updates. The crisis in many ways is an accelerator and catalyst for developments which have already started. But if I put myself into the fall of this year, I think we will see that the economic situation has deteriorated, where the discussion in a good number of member states will become stronger. Do we really now need a 750 billion package providing so much assistance to others where we need much more assistance for our own people? I think in a good number of countries you will have that attitude. In the country which I think will be the last to fall to find a compromise, which is the Netherlands, by the way, you have a public opinion which is very skeptical at this moment already about the MFF agreement and the recovery fund, potential recovery fund agreement. So you have to look into different member states and you will see a very different picture. But we are in a very volatile situation. And it was interesting that the country which will assume the presidency in a couple of weeks, Germany, and the Chancellor yesterday was saying, if we don't get our act together, if we don't get an agreement on the MFF and the recovery fund, this is what will play into the hands of the populists. So she was already warning us of what will happen if we don't get an agreement, which I think is sane.
Okay, can I just come back on the other part of the question about the potential of delay in MFF, and it was linked to Brexit, because there was the suggestion with the German presidency that first you do this, sort of 3 phases. You do this, then you do Brexit, and then at the end, more towards the end of the year, you do new pact on migration, asylum, and so on. Fabian, we saw that meeting of Boris Johnson with the EU institution leaders on Monday. Again, a bit like the summit, lots of positive words. Well, in case of the summit, you've taken those positive words about the mood and the tone of today's discussion as a genuine positive. How did you read the tone of the meeting and the substance of it?
I think firstly, it's important to recognize that not all of those words were positive, and that some of the positive words had quite a spike hidden behind them, because there is an enormous amount of frustration on the EU side that on the negotiations nothing has progressed, that we are no further forward in finding an agreement on the deal, that in many areas we're actually going backward. The German presidency has put something pragmatic out there, which is to say that we will have to get some form of agreement by October if we want to have any chance of ratifying it before the end of the year. But that is not, in my view, a positive statement. That is simply a statement of fact. So we are in a situation where Brexit isn't progressing. Yes, it could well be that if the MFF is not agreed quickly enough, that these two things are starting to run in parallel. But I think what is very clear is where the priority lies for the EU 27. And that will mean that Brexit will not be allowed to distract from those priorities. And we should never forget that the end of the year default is not a deal. The end of the year default remains no deal at all. So if there is significant disagreement, if there are significant problems for the EU 27 on Brexit, the only outcome which could then happen at the end of the year is no deal at all.
And it was quite striking, as you say, that mixture of the generally positive tone and we need to step up momentum and so on. And then Charles Michel, borrowing from Donald Tusk's era of using British colloquialisms to talk about Brexit, he responded to a typical Boris Johnson. He likes to sort of have a bit of bluster and he said, we need to put a tiger in the tank. Now, that is a reference to a petrol advert from, when I was a child. So it's a very old reference. Most people in the UK would have wondered what he was talking about. Charles Michel went one further and said, we're happy to put a tiger in the tank, but we won't accept a pig in a poke. I've subsequently discovered that a poke is a bag, and that's why the pig is there. You bought it sight unseen. But Janis, it's quite interesting, this mixture of, do we read then the positive words as nobody wanting to accept the blame when it goes wrong? So we're already into, we're all being constructive, we're all being positive. And Boris Johnson also talked about getting a deal in July. Well, we've talked about some of the challenges elsewhere, and given that after months of virtual negotiations, we are nowhere, and as Fabian said, going backwards, I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it? Forgive my cynicism, but
no, I think I think it's analytically correct. We're not moving. We're not moving quickly enough. We're not moving in the right direction. I think that the level of trust is at the lowest level we've seen up to now. It might even go further down. So there's a lot of distrust on the EU 27 side vis-a-vis London. There's the hope that things would move in the right direction, but the hope is very, very, very small. So yes, you're preparing yourself for a very negative scenario of not getting to a deal. And then you will have, again, the situation where there probably will be a blame game. Who's to be blamed? And the EU 27 will not want to get blamed for this. But I think it's important that, we've seen that and we've been discussing that for a while now, on the EU 27 side, Brexit is not the issue number one, obviously not. There are other issues which are much more important. So I don't also think that Brexit at the end of the day will interfere with the things which actually from the EU 27 perspective are the most important stuff. And this is obviously not Brexit. But to be positive or optimistic at this point in time, I think would be dreaming. So,
Fabian, I know you want to come back in, but linked to that, Marta, and linked to the question earlier, do you think there is, if the MFF deal is not done in July, and we get closer and closer to what most people say is the real deadline for Brexit, which is not in July, but more like September, October, to clinch a deal, do you see the two things becoming conflated, or given Janis's suggestion, no, the MFF and the Recovery Fund is so much more important to the EU 27 now, does one taint the other or not at all, do you think? And then Fabian, I'll come back to you.
No, I agree with Janis. I don't think the two will be related. The MFF discussion has been going on for a while, and I think it has been very detached from Brexit. The only mention of Brexit in the MFF discussion is about it's at the origin, yes, of this elimination of rebates and correction. What about the eventual Brexit gap? How would the UK engage with EU programs? But we could dismiss these are technicalities. Politically, the fact that Brexit has not been agreed yet, it's irrelevant for the MFF.
Fabian.
Actually, just one point to add to that, I think we should also bear in mind that if there is no deal, then there will be tariffs on British products, which means that own resources will increase automatically. So I think that's something also to bear in mind, that it's not necessarily only unhelpful in terms of the MFF. But I think the key point with Brexit, and I think we should stop talking about it because it isn't the most important thing the European Union is facing. But the key thing with Brexit is we simply have no progress on the core differences in these negotiations. There are the 4 or 5 areas where things are not moving including the overall governance framework, including level playing field conditions. We have the lack of implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is very worrying to member states. So unless anything moves on these core issues, then everything else is theater. Everything else is not actually going to change the likelihood of a deal or not. And for the moment, we're not moving on these. And the only way we could move on this is if Boris Johnson does one of his spectacular U-turns.
And as you've indicated, that question of trust, and hence the reference to a pig in a poke, because as I understood Charles Michel, what he was really meaning was the UK are asking us to take things in good faith in relation to level playing fields and so on, and we don't see much good faith.
Yeah,
so why would we do that? So we are in, as you say, a situation where, and it still strikes me that the UK think we're talking about nothing else in Brussels, whereas you say other things are so much more important. But let us move to another issue for this week briefly, if we could, before we close, Janis, and that is Schengen and the exit from at least this phase of COVID-19 in many countries. So we have seen a lot of borders opening up this week. It felt like there was more coordination. It felt as if EU countries were beginning to align themselves and try to do something in common with some exceptions. Is that a positive sign, or do you think it's still very fragmented? And what does that tell us about if we have another wave, God forbid, and countries go back into some form of lockdown? Do you feel that they're coming together and that Schengen is genuinely being restored, or not?
Well, first of all, coordination among the EU27 on these issues would be very positive. But I think there is a lack of coordination. And also when you listen to the press conference, you carefully listen to Charles Michel, for example, he could, in a response to a question related to that he was asked, his response was, we need a higher level of coordination. So yes, things are moving. I think they're moving because there is a natural inclination as we're moving into a new phase of the actual health crisis, as we're witnessing deconfinement, as people are starting to travel within countries, but also now beyond national borders. So I think there's an increased pressure to get things moving. But actually, coordination, I don't think that we're seeing enough. We're seeing that there are very different rules in different member states. We're seeing that some countries feel discriminated. You have lists of countries on an A list, on a B list, some which are less secure and others which are more secure, but that changes within weeks. So I think we're moving, but we're far away from having an actual coordination process, which we should have started weeks ago. We entered in chaos into the crisis. I think we early enough could have started with coordinating more among each other. Now at least we have a website. We open EU, where you can get some information about where things stand. But if you look actually into that website, you will see that the information which is being provided is not very thorough, is very limited. So it doesn't really help you that much if you want to travel these days to Italy or to wherever you want to travel. But at least there is an attempt to share that information, to provide information, which means that if we find ourselves in a difficult situation in individual countries, in certain regions, I hope we will learn from the mistakes which we've committed, but I'm not sure that we will, because it seems that on these issues, there is a lot of egoism, there has been a lot of egoism, and I think there will continue to be a lot of egoism, and you use that argument of closing borders as a nice way to pretend that actually you're doing something, whereas we know that when the virus is already in the country, that doesn't really help.
And then I think a point, Fabian, you've made before, that also the reopening of borders can sometimes be much more driven by the economics, particularly as we move into the tourism season, and nobody wants to be the last to open up because they fear they'll lose the tourism. So it's not being driven by any desire, particularly to reinstate the basic rules of the club. But you wanted to say something on this, brief one if you would, and then we'll draw conclusions and wrap up.
Very briefly, I think it is very important that there is attention on this, because I think the ability for people to travel within Europe is one of the core achievements of European integration, and many people are feeling the limitation. It isn't trivial that people cannot go on holiday to other countries. This is something which is deep in the DNA of Europeans. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the effect it has if for a prolonged period this is not possible. Of course, this has to be done carefully. Of course, there has to be coordination. But I think the aim has to be that we make it possible, because for me at least, it must be one of the priorities, not only because of the economic impact, but because it is really the way many people feel European integration is working for them.
And could therefore, when we talk about public opinion, in the long run be a positive, because it's made people realise what happens when borders close. But let's come back, if I might, to today's summit and to the key issue under discussion, the budget, the MFF and the recovery programme. And I want to just ask each of you, I asked you at the beginning for your snapshot assessment of where we are today, and if I could sum it up, it was no harm done. Nobody put a roadblock in the way, nobody made things more difficult, so we can move forward, and you all saw that as a positive. But when you look, knowing what we know now about the way member states are lining up and the positions that they're taking, are you confident, in 1 minute each, and I'll start with Marta again, that what will emerge from these negotiations, whenever it comes, if it comes in July or more over the summer, will be an adequate response? Will, going back to John Palmer's point about public opinion, will the public and critics be convinced that the EU has stepped up to the plate and delivered at a time of exceptional circumstance? How confident are you? Marta, you first, then Janis, and I'll finish with Fabian.
I'm quite positive, to be honest. Yes, it will be a classic European compromise, so not everyone will be at his ideal position. But I think overall this will be anyway good for two reasons. One is that at least in some countries, the funding will make a difference. So it is relevant from an economic point of view. And the second reason is that it creates a precedent, a very strong precedent, actually, for what the EU can do in future crises. And I think creating the precedents of the Commission borrowing on markets to react to a common, whether it's symmetric or asymmetric shock, I think that's very important.
Okay, so a fairly upbeat assessment at this stage. Janis, do you share Marta's optimism?
I think it's Friday, so I'm also optimistic. No, jokes aside, my expectation is yes, we're going to get to an agreement. I think chances are much higher now that we might get an agreement already in July. If you ask me, if you would force me to bet, I would say rather July than after the summer, which means I'm taking a risk. But I think that we're moving in the right direction. The second, will this be enough? Well, obviously it won't be enough, because this is the nature of a European compromise. It is not enough. But if we would not have an agreement, I think that signal would be enormously negative. So even if the compromise is not an optimal one, it will be much, much better than not having an agreement. And I think that what we will see is that more will have to be done in the future. First of all, we will be using all means at our disposal. So people have forgotten that we have an agreement on the ESM. We will be using also the ESM in the months and years to come. And I think additional things will have to be done when the time is right. So this will not be enough from a long-term perspective.
Thank you. Fabian, glass half full, glass half empty at this stage. What is your instinct about how well this is going to come out?
Both. I think we have a lot of positive signs. I think this is an absolutely necessary step, but it's not a sufficient step. And I think we have always said that it's important that we don't lose sight of the range of different instruments. Janis has mentioned the ESM. Of course, the ECB is an absolutely crucial part of this overall picture. And all of these instruments will have to continue firing as long as this crisis is going on, which will, from everything we know now, going to be for a while. But I think the one thing which I would go back to highlight, which I think is absolutely crucial, is in the end, people will judge this by the outcomes they feel. They will not judge it by what kind of political agreements there have been, whether we have managed to get a deal or not. They will feel whether their jobs have been saved, whether their economy has been saved, and that will be a very direct feeling. And for me, one of the big worries we have, and I think this is something which wasn't mentioned at the summit, but which should have been, is going back to this 50% question, that we have one country in the European Union which at the moment is outspending by a vast degree all of the other countries, which has the potential of distorting economies for a long time to come. I think that is something we really have to watch, and we shouldn't lose sight that that is a problem we have to tackle, and that nothing in the package so far is even talking about that issue.
Okay. And on that note, thank you very much. These are issues we will come back to next week when we have a special weekly update for you. It'll be at a slightly later time of 11:30, and it'll be slightly longer, 90 minutes instead of the usual 60 minutes, because we will have with us Herman Van Rompuy, President Emeritus of the European Council, of course, and the President of the EPC. And we'll also be joined by Brigitte Lafan, Director of the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies, a member of the EPC Strategic Council. And with Janis and Fabian, we're going to take a little look at where we are now, 4 months in to the crisis. We had a discussion with Herman Van Rompuy early in the crisis about whether this was a turning point for the EU. We want to come back to that and consider what we've seen, how we assess it, what lessons we've learned, and where we go from here. So watch out for that one. Also, lots of events next week. Can't mention them all, but I would just highlight related to what we've been talking about today. Brexit chief negotiator Michel Barnier will be taking stock of the Brexit negotiations with Fabian on Wednesday. There's also, by the way, you may have already seen the multi-author paper on the EU-UK relationship that was published by the EPC yesterday, and there'll be a discussion paper on Brexit from the UK's perspective by Roger Liddell being published next week. Also other events, how to boost EU resilience in the aftermath of COVID-19 with Maroš Šefčovič, the European Commission Vice President for Interinstitutional Relations and Foresight. And then after the Friday update in the afternoon, an EU budget for the recovery, what to expect after the summer. So building on our conversation today, that is with Gert-Jan Koopman, Director General for Budget in the European Commission. Many, many other events, too numerous to mention, and one more publication, a commentary on the planned new pact for asylum and immigration. We've talked about this at the weekly update in the past. We're awaiting those proposals. So again, watch this space. But it only remains for me to thank you so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon when the sun is shining. As I say, we wanted to bring you a quick analysis of the summit, so we hope you found that helpful. Thank you so much again to Marta. Great to have you with us, and we'll see you next time they come back to this topic. Janis, thank you. Fabian, have a very good weekend. Thank you for watching, and take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.